This is talking about how cells harvest the chemical energy. So the chemical energy comes from glucose. So there's energy stored in glucose, and then it's converted into ATP, which is what your cells can use. So I said that the chapter starts off talking about this thing that babies have and bears have, and now we're learning that some adults have it too, but not every adult has the same amount. So this is talking about brown fat. So if you want to know more about that, you should read through this. There's a section in the book later on in the chapter that talks about brown fat specifically. But in order to really understand why brown fat works, we have to learn more about the process of photosynthesis. Sorry, respiration, not photosynthesis, respiration. And the reason that brown fat works to help keep people warm is that rather than making ATP and being as efficient as possible, so rather than trying to get up to the 38 ATP, the cellular respiration process doesn't make as much ATP, it just creates excess heat instead. So brown fat is something that babies have that helps them keep warm, because something that babies don't do very well is regulate their own body temperature. Okay, so that's something that when my kiddo was born in April, we spent 2 days in the hospital. That's fairly typical. You're about 2 days in the hospital, then you're released to go home. But they check the baby's temperature to make sure that the baby's able to regulate their temperature. Because if they can't, then they might keep you longer. Because that's something that babies' bodies have to figure out how to do. Okay, so that brown fat helps with that. It's kind of a short circuit for the cellular respiration process. So here's the picture of the screaming baby. Yes, sometimes they do look like that, and they scream a lot. Yeah, kind of pink, kind of reddish. That hopefully doesn't last very long, but you never know. Depends on the kid. So, first section talks about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Hopefully, you already know what kinds of organisms perform these two things. So, what types of things do photosynthesis? Plants. Algae is another example. Okay, not SpongeBob. Sponges do not perform photosynthesis. They're not plants. They actually eat detritus, which is poop. They eat marine snow, is what it's called as a nickname, and it's poop. Sponges filter the water and take in like fish poop.
Wait, I thought it was like a sponge that you used to clean with, not like a sponge.
Can you actually wash something with a sponge?
Sponges are actually not very soft. So the sponges that we get at the store are manufactured.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not like the sponges that are in the ocean.
I didn't know.
Those tend to be rougher. They're not very soft. Okay. So what does an organism need to perform photosynthesis? What organelle? They need the sun.
Mitochondria.
What organelle do they need for photosynthesis? Chloroplast. So that's this green thing here, right? Okay. What do organisms need to perform cellular respiration?
Mitochondria.
The mitochondria.
Yeah.
Okay. So to perform cellular respiration, you need organic molecules. That can be glucose. We can also perform cellular respiration from fat or from protein. So we need something that's organic, and we need oxygen. And then we need the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are what make ATP, and we get water and carbon dioxide from that. Photosynthesis is the opposite process of that. So the relationship between the two is pretty much that they're opposites of each other. So you should be able to take a diagram like this and fill it in. Okay, so we get energy from the sun. Photosynthesis happens in chloroplasts. Cellular respiration happens in mitochondria. Go.
So do starfish use photosynthesis?
Starfish are not photosynthetic. They also eat things. So starfish tend to eat urchins or clams. They can eat other organisms as well, but there are two types of plants that I'm aware of that are able to ingest other things, but they don't use them. So when we think eating, we tend to think like for nutrition to make ATP. They don't use them to make energy. They're not using them in their mitochondria. When Venus flytraps or pitcher plants digest something, they literally are using the pieces of that to build new protein or build new cells. They're not using it to make ATP to get energy.
So they got fly cells.
So they have, like the fly traps will only grow in certain types of soil. So if you have a Venus flytrap and you plant it in a soil that's got fertilizer in it, it's not going to grow the fly traps themselves. It'll just grow other leaves that aren't specialized, because the fly traps are a specialized type of leaf. The plant won't grow those because it's getting all the nutrition it needs from the soil. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so how do they eat the flies if they don't have like little tiny mouths? How do they do it?
So they secrete enzymes that break down the fly inside of the fly trap, and then they absorb that. So like the fly trap is kind of like their stomach.
So
It's
like,
open.
If I stuck my finger in there and it went like that, it wouldn't hurt me, would it?
If you left your finger in there for a long time, it would probably start to break down your finger. It would be like if, so this was actually literally a would you rather question that I got one time. Would you rather sit in a tub full of vomit for 5 minutes, or a tub full of like cow poop for 5 minutes? And the would you rather is, what would you rather do? So I asked my husband that, and he's like, well, how long do I have to sit in there again? 5 minutes? Okay, I'll take the cow poop. The reason is, if you sit in someone's vomit, there's stomach acid in that, and that stomach acid is acidic. It could start to break your skin down. Okay?
Because if I,
Like,
cow poop is
if I did it for like 10 seconds.
yes,
then
it's
I would-
gross. The whole point is it's gross.
like,
But
do you know if cow
stomach acid is acidic, so it's going to start breaking stuff down.
putting your toe in and then just slowly
So the
sinking
fly
down?
trap, if you put your finger in, you'd be able to pull your finger out.
So, like,
Okay,
the little
you're
claws
not a
aren't
fly.
really-
The claws aren't really sharp. They just keep a fly from being able to crawl back out. And yeah, the fly traps are sticky too, a little bit. It's kind of like syrup. It's sticky. Okay, so
quite understand how your finger would just like, would it like just disappear basically, or would it like?
if your finger started to break down,
It just
Yeah.
burned.
it's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen instantly, and it would start to burn. If you accidentally splash acid on yourself in a chemistry lab, it burns. You feel it.
So, it's like, just eats away at your finger.
It would eat away at your skin, yeah.
So
Yeah,
can
great.
This fly trap eat more than flies? So like what other?
They can eat other insects. Usually it's insects that they eat though, because those are small enough to fly into the leaf, and
they
they're
can eat like a
weak
little
enough
frog.
that they can't break themselves out.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be able to eat a frog.
Like a little
because-
frog, like a baby frog.
I don't know.
I think I said
I don't know. My guess is no, because frogs have pretty strong legs, so the frog would probably kick.
Yeah.
If you feed it hamburger, it dies. My dad
Really?
that.
Did your? Yeah, I don't think it's supposed to eat
Maybe
anything.
spiders.
Why would
Okay,
it be
probably.
hamburger,
That's
though?
like the spider's legs are so long, so it'd be like outside. and-
Depends on how big the spider is. Some spiders are small.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
It's like a-
So, relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. You need to know those. You also need to know the relationship between breathing and cellular respiration. So, breathing is not cellular respiration. They are two different things.
So does cellular respiration help with breathing?
So, cellular respiration uses the oxygen that you breathe in and produces the CO2, the carbon dioxide, that you breathe out.
So two completely.
So, they are related to each other. So, this diagram kind of shows that. When you breathe in, what system does the air go into?
Respiratory.
Your respiratory system. So, it's absorbed by your
Lungs.
lungs. Okay, see? Ta-da. So, you breathe in O2, it's absorbed by your lungs. The oxygen travels through your bloodstream and is exchanged at the cell membrane. So, this is why diffusion rates are important and the size of the cell is important, because your cell has to be able to take in oxygen and get rid of CO2 quickly. It has to happen pretty fast. Okay, so as that process happens, your blood goes from being a brighter red to a darker red. It's not blue. The blood's not blue. Okay, it's red all the time. But you breathe in O2, you breathe out CO2.
This is new information to me.
What? Okay, yeah, your blood's not blue. It's always red. What causes your blood to be red?
Oxygen.
Iron.
But
Iron. So the difference in the reds, it's a dark red versus a bright red, that's oxygen. So when your blood is oxygenated, when your red blood cells are carrying oxygen, it's a bright red. Once they drop off the oxygen and your blood cells don't have oxygen on them anymore, there's still iron there, so it's a dark red. This is also why if you go down to Georgia or some other states in the south, the soil's red. There's a lot of iron in the soil, so it's red. It's oxidizing. Yeah. Okay, it's red. So,
Ivor's like silver. It's like a silver.
it When iron is used in steel, the metal tends to have a silver color. But think of it, cars have iron on them, and when the iron rusts, the rust is red. So iron is red in the presence of oxygen when it oxidizes.
That's why you like can't like leave your bike out in the rain because
That's why you shouldn't leave your bike out in the rain, because it will start to oxidize. It'll
Yeah,
rust.
but it'll also get wet too, so that's kind of stupid.
Well, okay. Perfect world, your bike never gets wet. Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. Okay. So the relationship between breathing and cellular respiration, you should know that. Okay. You need to know the overall reaction for CR. I'm abbreviating cellular respiration as CR. Okay. So cellular respiration is glucose, which is C6H12O6, plus oxygen, which is O2, and that yields, or you get, CO2, which is carbon dioxide, H2O is water, and you get ATP.
oh,
Okay.
that's like a combustion reaction.
Sort of. Realistically, notice I said it's an overall reaction because this doesn't happen all at once. There's at least 20 steps between these two things and these three things. So when we say overall reaction, it's taking the start of the process to the end of the process and summarizing it for you. There's a lot of little reactions. And lucky for you, you don't have to know all the little reactions in between. That's a good thing, okay? Yeah, thank goodness. Now, if you take a biology class in college, you might have to know the whole process, or at least more of the process. So there's a lot more to know. You don't have to know all of it, okay? So cellular respiration, we talked about ATP, or the movie talked about ATP and cellular respiration. So with cellular respiration, you get ATP and heat. ATP, you get somewhere between 29 and 38 ATP. 38 is an ideal situation. So if nothing from the glucose is being used for anything but making ATP, and the cell has everything else it needs, then you can get 38. Realistically, it's more like 29 or 30, and that's the number that Hank in the movie talked about. Okay, you also get heat. So heat's a byproduct of a lot of reactions in the body, and with cellular respiration, we don't get 100% of the energy from glucose converted into ATP. We only get about 34% of the energy from glucose as ATP. So that's actually really efficient. When we burn fuel in our cars, that's about 25% efficient. So our bodies are more efficient than the machines that we make, which is something that we see with lots of other animals when we talk about flight plans and trying to design wings and things like that too. Nature's more efficient than what we can build at this point. So most of the energy that's burned from glucose is released as heat. So remember brown fat, okay, referencing back to that. That ratio is different. Rather than making ATP with brown fat, when brown fat burns glucose, almost all of it is released as heat instead of being used to make ATP. Okay, so that's a difference that brown fat has versus regular fat.
So like that's why when you work out you get really, really hot.
When you work out, you get really hot because when you work out, you require more energy.
Yeah.
So respiration happens more quickly. Therefore, you release more heat.
Yeah.
So the question that's underneath this Post-it note says, why is sweating and other body cooling mechanisms necessary during vigorous exercise? Because when you exercise, you produce extra heat.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to sweat. Okay. So when you sweat, that takes the liquid that's produced on your skin and causes you to cool down when that evaporates, which is why if you work out in a place that's really humid, you don't cool off very much because less of the water evaporates off of your skin. So it's the evaporation that cools you down, not the sweating itself. Does that make sense? You're like, huh? Okay. So this is, and I mentioned this before, you use a lot of ATP. So if we didn't recycle ADP and phosphate to make new ATP, you would use your weight in ATP every day, like your body weight every day. That's a lot of ATP. So it's a good thing that we recycle it.
She'd have to eat a lot.
We'd eat a lot more. We'd be like pandas. Pandas spend up to 16 hours a day eating.
Yep.
Not sleeping, eating. Like,
I mean,
they eat a lot of bamboo. Okay?
women are super skinny though.
And they're fat.
Yeah, well,
so
yeah,
you can't even
comparatively.
use that energy for anything.
Right, they don't use all of it. You're right. Okay, so this section talks about the fact that we use ATP for everything.
So they don't die.
So if you're talking about a diet or trying to calculate how much energy you need to eat, your calories, just keep in mind calories are a unit of energy. So if we talk about kilocalories, and you look at the nutrition labels that say calories, a kilocalorie is actually a capital C calorie. Pretty much nutritionists say calories and biologists say kilocalories. They mean the same thing. Okay? Don't ask me why. I think somebody planned, let's try to confuse biology students. That's what their plan.
That's what they always
Evil
try to do in
scientists.
science. They literally make the questions 10 times harder
Than they need to be? Okay, so here's a question from this. If you walk at 3 miles per hour, how far would you have to travel to burn off the equivalent of an extra slice of pizza, which has about 475 kilocalories? If you know how many calories you use by walking, then you can do that calculation. So sometimes when we're talking about calories and counting calories, it's a matter of doing math. So this is also why if you're trying to eat at an energy deficit and eat less than you use every day, you know that you can burn fat because your body has to use a certain amount of energy just to live. Even if all you do is sit on a couch all day, you're going to use energy to
How do
survive.
you track that?
Great question. That depends on who you talk to. But there's different things you can use, like your height and your age, because that affects how quickly you burn energy. How active you are. So do you sit around all day on the couch? Do you walk around? Do you exercise every day? So your level of activity determines how much energy you need. And then things like whether you want to maintain your weight or gain weight or lose weight help you determine how much you need to eat. But you can do calculations based on your heart rate. So it's called your basal metabolic rate, or your starting, like, resting heart rate. And then you can run around and see what your other heart rate is after you've been active. You can use calculations like that to figure out how many calories you should eat. But there are things like MyFitnessPal, which have all of that stuff built in, and they ask you questions like, how tall are you and what's your current weight? And do you want to lose weight? So they'll ask, how much weight do you want to lose? And I think MyFitnessPal only lets you calculate to lose like 2 pounds a week, which is really fast. Losing 2 pounds a week is a pretty high rate. And that's in an ideal world. So you have to sleep enough, you have to drink enough water. If you're not doing those things, you won't lose 2 pounds.
You also got a job.
Yeah, I mean, there's other things you have to do. So there might be weeks when you don't lose 2 pounds because work happens, or you don't get to work out, or you eat an extra slice of pizza that you shouldn't. So, but that's talking about ATP and what that looks like and exercising. So then we're talking about how do we actually get the energy from glucose? And this works based on redox reactions and electron transport chains and electron carriers. So, starting with redox reactions. There's definitions in here. I summarized it on my post-it note. So a redox reaction is a combination of something being reduced or reduction happening and something being oxidized or oxidation taking place. So when something is oxidized, it loses electrons, which means it loses energy. Okay, a lot of the time when we're talking about losing electrons, it means that the molecule is also losing hydrogen. So hydrogen atoms get pulled away and electrons get pulled away too. So that's losing energy, and then something else has to gain some of that energy. So the electrons and hydrogen go somewhere. They don't just disappear, and whatever molecule they get attached to gains that energy. So this happens when we're looking at cellular respiration. So this is the overall reaction again. We have glucose plus oxygen, O2, yields carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So the glucose is oxidized. It loses hydrogen and electrons. So the carbon molecules and the oxygen molecules become CO2. Okay, they're broken down into smaller chunks, and electrons and hydrogen have been pulled off. Then the O2, the oxygen, is reduced, so it gains energy because hydrogen and electrons are added to it. So this overall reaction is a redox reaction because reduction is happening and oxidation is happening. That's redox. This is something you may or may not have learned about in chemistry. Redox reactions can be confusing because we're looking at electrons and then hydrogen atoms, and it's positives and negatives, and it's like all over the place. And some teachers teach them in halves. So you'll take one reaction that looks like this and write it twice to show the reduction part and then the oxidation part. I'm not going to ask you to write out reduction reactions. I'm not going to ask you to be able to do reduction reactions or look at balancing things like that. But you should know this part. So this is also at the bottom of this page. And maybe this makes more sense than what I wrote because it's not my handwriting. Okay. But you should be able to tell me what gets oxidized and what gets reduced. Okay. And we'll come back to oxidation and reduction in bell work and throughout the next couple of weeks so that it makes more sense. Okay, but that's the first part of cellular respiration. Something has energy removed from it, and then another molecule gains some of that energy. Okay, so that's redox. When we talk about then electron transport chains and NAD+, these are molecules that hold the electrons temporarily. So NAD+ has a positive charge, and you can add electrons and hydrogen to it so that it changes its form. So it goes from NAD+, which the guy in the video talked about being a vitamin. It is a vitamin, it's a B vitamin. So you can go from NAD+ to NADH by adding electrons and hydrogen. So that NAD+ is used in cellular respiration to pass off the energy so that it ends up in ATP, or it ends up in the water. Go ahead. So if you take a vitamin, it helps your body resupply its source of NAD+. So from a B vitamin, we can make that into different molecules. So we can take the B vitamin and make it into NAD+. NAD+ is something that your body recycles, just like we recycle and reuse the ATP and then the ADP and phosphate. So we take ADP and phosphate and join it together to make ATP. We take NAD+ and use it to make NADH, but then the NADH becomes NAD+ again. But eventually, if you use something enough, you have to replace it. So your body does have to replace some of the NAD+ and other things like that periodically. So taking vitamins helps with that process. Makes it easier for you to do that instead of having to build NAD+ from something else that you eat. Okay. So we got NAD+, and we have, this is what NAD+ looks like. Okay, so remember I said it starts off as NAD+, then it becomes NADH. Okay, it gets reduced. Remember, reduction is gaining electrons, it's gaining energy. So it gains a hydrogen ion and 2 electrons to go from NAD+ to NADH. And that happens when we oxidize glucose, like C6H12O6, or fat or protein. So we take electrons from whatever we're using for cellular respiration and add them onto the NAD+. That happens a couple of different ways. We'll talk about those later, and we'll talk about the stages tomorrow for cellular respiration. But there are 3 stages. They happen in different places. You'll get to know those too.